The former president returns to Washington, not to visit the White House, as some former presidents do, not to take a seat of honor at some national celebration, not to attend an academic conference studying his presidency or to deliver a speech on a matter of national importance. No, the former president returns to Washington to be arraigned on felony charges for what he did as president. And what he did as president has never been done before. Thus, the charges being brought against him have never been seen before. Therefore, Washington continues to react to another historic day. President Trump's indictment on 4 felony counts in the January 6th special counsel case. The former president is due in court here in Washington, D.C. tomorrow. He is denied wrongdoing. Multiple 2024 Republican candidates have come in some manner or another to the former president's defense. But after the indictment, former Vice President Pence, whose role on January 6th is detailed in the 45-page indictment, criticized his former boss's actions.
I really do believe that anyone who puts themselves over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. And anyone who asks someone else to put themselves over the Constitution should never be president of the United States again.
For more on this, Robert Costa and Scott MacFarlane join us now. Robert is CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent. Scott is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Robert, I want to start with you. The former vice president has been vocal, both first in statement and now in comments at the Indiana State Fair, and he's a fact witness in this matter.
He's emerging as a key witness in this investigation based on the indictment, also emerging as a key critic of Trump in the 2024 Republican presidential race. Pence is so crucial because he was the last option for Trump in those final days of the Trump administration. He believed that if he could just nudge Pence to somehow disavow what was going on January 6, 2021, and not be the overseer of this process, but be someone who actively tried to ruin it and upend it, then he could stay in office and hold on to the presidency. Pence, as we all know, and now under oath detailed to the grand jury, refused to do so. And the details of what Trump said to Pence on January 5th and January 6th are really going to matter in terms of whether Trump is convicted here. Did Pence tell this grand jury that he believed Trump was really asking him to break the law? Pence has said publicly he doesn't know if Trump had criminal intent, but that he is really now the person to watch as a witness.
And Robert, I want to get your sense of the vocalness that has come from the vice president today, because it seems to have been accelerated by the fact pattern laid out in the indictment, like he is somehow now being thrust into this moment that he had to anticipate because he knew he had testified to the special counsel.
It's fascinating political, historical, legal timing, because this all coincides with Pence being on the brink of maybe leaving the Republican presidential race if he doesn't make that debate stage in August later this month. Pence needs to show the Republican electorate that he's a competitive candidate in the 2024 race, and he's also playing for his own legacy by reminding people about what he went through in 2021. And he seems to now be unbound in a way we haven't seen Mike Pence for years. Major, I covered him going back to the House of Representatives.
Yes,
this has always been someone who is tightly wound in terms of his political message. He comes from the radio show days in Indiana. He had the Mike Pence show. He famously called himself Rush Limbaugh on decaf.
Right.
But he was always contained, and he's still contained now in what he's telling voters. But he's saying that Trump asked him to break the law and go against the Constitution. Because of the way Pence delivers the line, it seems calm and normal, but the message, the words are anything but.
Scott MacFarlane, you have been covering all of this and so much at the federal courthouse dealing with ramifications, criminally and otherwise, of January 6th. Give our audience a sense of what it's likely to witness tomorrow.
Tomorrow is going to happen no matter what. Donald Trump's going to be having this initial appearance no matter what. The complexion of that hearing, though, is subject to change, Major. Let's talk about the courthouse itself. They have these types of appearances several times a day, every weekday. Initial appearances by felony criminal defendants. Typically, they take just a few minutes. The defendant's brought into the courthouse, sometimes to the marshals for processing, potentially fingerprinting or booking, then brought to the courtroom where he or she can enter a not guilty plea, learn something about the release conditions. Will there be restrictions on his or her travel, on his or her talking to possible witnesses in the case? Maybe in some serious cases involving people who are a flight risk, you give up your passport, you have a booking photo taken. The latter won't happen with former President Trump, but all of this should be wrapped up in the matter of a few minutes. It's a garden variety proceeding, but this is not a garden variety defendant.
to put it mildly. And yes, as we all know, existentially and otherwise, tomorrow will come no matter what. Tell us a little bit about the judge who has been given this case, how that process played out, meaning how the judge got it, and who this judge is.
After tomorrow, after the former president faces the magistrate judge in this case, his case shifts to Judge Tanya Chutkin, a U.S. district judge appointed in 2014 by then-President Obama. I've been in Judge Chutkin's court a lot, watching a number of January 6 sentencing hearings by the dozen. I can tell you she is uniquely, distinctively strident in her denunciations of January 6th and critical of everything that gave rise to it. She's called January 6 horrifying. She's called it a violent attempt to overthrow the government. She has said the people in that mob were showing fealty to one man, not to the Constitution. She has been the rare judge here in Washington, among the dozens of judges to handle January 6 cases, to exceed the Department of Justice recommendations for sentences for defendants. She toes a hard line, a distinctively hard line, in cases involving January 6th.
And Robert, I want to ask you about something that has begun to formulate around the Trump camp, which is he was following the advice of lawyers and therefore is immune from any sort of successful prosecution because the president was just listening to what some lawyers told him.
He was following the advice of lawyers. He was also pushing his lawyers to be aggressive and to try to overturn the election.
When other lawyers were telling him there is no basis by which to pursue this or these other particular strategies.
So he really listened to outside counsel during the final days of the administration. Sidney Powell, an outside lawyer, was telling him, you have the right to have an executive order and seize voting machines with the military. Rudy Giuliani was saying, we can go to the states and have the state legislatures send electors along. John Eastman, a conservative lawyer from California, was saying Mike Pence could walk away from the lectern on January 6th, and this whole process could be delayed for days, if not weeks. He really listened to them over people like Eric Hirschman, a White House attorney, or Pat Cipollone, his then White House counsel, or his then Attorney General William Barr. All of these lawyers around Trump informally inside of the administration were saying you do not have the right or the evidence or any kind of legal basis for trying to overthrow this election. But Trump kept listening to people on the outside. That said, Trump was always saying to them, let's do more. What else can we do? Let's take this to the brink. I talked to so many sources who were close to Trump in the final days, and they say he was the ringleader, in their view, of the effort.
The driving force. Scott MacFarlane, very quickly before I let you and Robert go, any sense of the general approach in terms of security or other things around the courthouse tomorrow?
There'll be a Secret Service escort for the former president. There'll be a heavy police presence in perimeter. We saw the same thing in Miami last month and the same thing in Manhattan earlier this year. It's also quite possible, Major, we don't see the former president. He'll likely be brought through an underground entrance into a courthouse where cameras are prohibited.
Robert Costa and Scott MacFarlane, thank you both very, very much.